Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is John Diamond. I'm the president and CEO of the University of Maine Alumni Association. So we're so glad to have you joining us tonight. This evening's topic is about an important person in the history of 20th century Maine. That's Maine Supreme Court Justice Albert Beliveau. A new biography of Justice Beliveau is now out, and its title is First Franco, Albert Beliveau in Law, Politics, and Love. It was written by Maine author Doug Rooks. Doug's also authored the book Statesman, George Mitchell and the Art of the Possible. His book about Justice Beliveau is being published by the University of Maine Press with support and participation from the university's Franco-American Center. To start the program tonight, we're first going to hear from Dr. Susan Panetta. She's a native of the St. John Valley, a UMaine alumna, a faculty member at the university, and the director of the university's Franco-American Center. She'll be followed by Justice Beliveu's son, Severn, and by Lee Ingalls Softly, who's the former Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Judicial Court. And she's also the current Dean of the University of Maine School of Law. She too is a UMaine alumna. I always have to point those things out. And then we'll hear from Doug, who will share his excerpts from the book, and he'll talk about the process of researching and writing it. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. And if you'd like to submit a question, just go to the bottom of your screen where you'll see a little comic book speech bubble there. That's the chat button. So to submit a question, many of you are accustomed to doing this, just click on that bubble, type in your question, and then hit the return or enter button on your keyboard. We'll get to as many questions as possible as the hour permits. And just so you know, we are recording this session and we'll be sending you an email afterwards, so you will have the link to share with others or to watch again if you'd like. And we'll also be including some information about how you can purchase the book that Doug has written, the book about Justice Beliveau. So with that, let's get started, and I'll turn it over to you, to Dr. Panetta.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to start by just giving some historical context to Franco-American migrations. Let me just share my screen here. All right, is that okay?
Yep.
All right. So this book was jointly published by Franco-American Programs and the University of Maine Press. And we published this book because of the importance of Franco-American migrations to Maine. As you can see by this map, Maine really juts up into the center of French-speaking Canada and is surrounded by the two French-speaking communities, the Acadians in New Brunswick and the French Canadians or the Quebecois from Quebec. In Maine, oftentimes people don't call themselves Franco-American, they refer to themselves as French. But when we're talking about, even though people in the community don't use the term Franco-American, the term Franco-American refers specifically not to people of France, but of people of Quebecois and Acadian heritage who moved to Maine and to the Northeast. This is Maine's largest ethnic minority, and French is the most common language after English. You can see here that these migrations are concentrated in the Northeast. And in Maine, French remains the most common language after English. I thought, since this was a program about lawyers, that I would throw in here the 1919 law from the state of Maine that was an English-only language law, and so that required that French not be used as a language of instruction in school. And so oftentimes you'll meet older Franco-Americans who talk about having to write on the blackboard, "I will not speak French in school." So this is Acadians. Severn's father was Acadian, and so the Acadians settled here first. And in 1755 started to be deported, and you can see here a map of the deportations. And the red line at the top follows the migration path of Severn's father. So when the deportations happened, not Severn's father, but his family. So when the deportations happened, his family moved to Quebec, and that was a very common migration path of Acadians who were seeking to escape the deportations. Some of the, as a little aside, some of the Acadians were sent to France, and then they moved to Louisiana, and that's where you get the term Cajun. The Acadiens became Cajun. You can see here that the Acadian migrations, or the scattering of the Acadians from the deportation, you ended up with the Madawaska settlements in northern Maine. And so that explains the French-speaking communities in northern Maine. And you also see that many Acadians moved to the Quebec region, and that was the Beliveau family. The Beliveau family moved to that Quebec region. That region is the kind of hub, the kind of heartland of the French-Canadian migrations into New England. And you see here the primary migration routes. And it wasn't just in Maine, it was all over New England. And they came to work in the textile mills and the shoe shops and the woolen factories. It was a very large migration. About 1 million French Canadians moved to New England. And it was 1 out of 3 French Canadians. In French-speaking Canada, they called it La Grande Saignée, or the Great Bleeding. You can see here in 40 years, towns like Lewiston went from having no French Canadians to 13,000. It was a massive migration, and it was felt very, very audibly by the people in New England. And just to kind of give some context for this book, one kind of little tidbit, there were, Franco-Americans are not known, and they're oftentimes ignored in US history and in federal programs. So this is a federal program that digitizes non-English language newspapers. You can see here how many non-English language newspapers they've digitized. This is how many French language newspapers they've digitized from Franco-Americans, and this is how many there were. And so just to give a sense of how the importance of the work that we're doing in publishing this book, and I want to thank, and I really enjoyed working with Michael on this book, and thank Doug and Severn for the opportunity to publish it. So I'm going to stop here. So next I'm going to introduce Severn Belliveau. Severn Belliveau is a founding partner of Pretty Flaherty. He's been active in Maine state politics for over 40 years, serving in the Maine House of Representatives and the Maine Senate, and acting as chairman for the Democratic Party of Maine. He's a recipient of the French Legion of Honor Award, the highest distinction France awards civilians, and he is the French consular agent for the state of Maine. He's a distinguished professor of Franco-American studies at the University of Maine and a tireless advocate for Franco-Americans. So to you, Severn.
Thank you, Susan. That was a wonderful introduction to the topic. That puts everything in perspective, and then that leads to what I want to comment on. That is, what was the history behind it? What was the genesis of this book? What caused us to support the writing of this book? And it all began probably 18 years ago when a group of us who were concerned about the attitude of the University of Maine towards the Franco community. We thought it was being neglected, hadn't been received the attention that it deserved. And in great part, the role of Yvon Labbé, who was the founder of the Franco-American Center. So he and I and others who were involved were concerned about what could we do to increase the profile of the Franco community in Maine. And could we find a personality that could be a role model, a personality of French-Canadian descent who could function in that role? We considered a number of personalities, a number of individuals, and concluded back then that my father was probably the best candidate for that position. So at that point, we conferred with Barry Rodrigue, who was a graduate student at the university at the time, later a professor at the University of Southern Maine. Barry undertook a very extensive research program, including visiting our home in Rumford, where we uncovered my father's files, which had been stored in the attic. They contained all of his books, records, files, photographs, documents that from early on until his retirement from law court. But in essence, what we found was, and we learned, and I'll just summarize very quickly, that my father's a good example of someone from the working class succeeding. And it began back in 1887 when he was born. Of course, he'd be 134 years old if he were alive today. 1900, he was left school at age 13 to help support his family by working in his father's store in Jay. He had a bakery at the time. From there, they went on to Rumford, and as Susan was saying, because paper companies, textile mills, and all were had a great demand for labor. As a consequence, the Quebec economy was suffering. So a number of Quebecois came to Maine, as did my grandparents in the late 1880s. So from there, from Lewiston to Jay to Rumford, where he again worked hard to support his family. His family was struggling, as did most of the French Canadians at the time. It did the Irish Catholics, the Italian Catholics, and all the ethnics were exposed to all the same hardships. But in any event, he proceeded his career, or his career at the time began with working in the paper mill in Rumford, and after a year or so, a year and a half of working 12-hour shifts, he found a position in my soon-to-be grandfather, Matthew McCarthy, who was a lawyer in Rumford and a municipal court judge at the time. And my grandfather hired him as a clerk, and he read law in that office. In 1909, he, without a college education and completing high school through correspondence courses, he was accepted at the University of Maine Law School in Bangor, where he completed 3 years and 2, graduated first in his class, number 1 in his the law school examination, returned to Rumford, became Oxford County attorney. Then for a couple of years, then he was in the military for a year, served 1 year in France, again as lieutenant, because he was bilingual. He was his language skills were utilized to negotiate on behalf of the Allies on a number of different projects throughout France. Returned to Rumford, developed his law practice, became very involved politically, and so much so that he ran for Congress in 1928, again 1930, failed both times, attributed the loss the second time, or both times in part to the fact that he was a strong anti-Catholic feeling that permeated, that existed statewide at the time. Then returned to his practice, and ironically was appointed by the governor at the time, by Governor Baxter, to be his military aide. That was quite an accomplishment. And eventually, in 1935, was appointed to the Superior Court. The book contains a great deal of information on the process for how he was selected and how he had to compete with others, and how, in fact, he was the first Catholic, first Franco to be appointed to the Superior Court back in 1935. Served there for 18 years, passed over several times for appointment to the Supreme Court for the same reasons that he had to deal with these other challenges in his life. Ultimately appointed by Governor Cross, a Republican, to the law court, which he served for several years, and then again as the oldest judge, not the senior judge, but the oldest judge on the law court, was denied appointment to the as Chief Justice by the then Governor Muskie. Ironically, both of whom were residents of Rumford. Both were Rumford natives. So that was essentially it. So that was a history of where we are. And again, I want to thank the University of Maine Press, and particularly Susan Panetta and everybody associated with this. This has been a magnificent undertaking. That we have reams and reams of material here that have been accumulated, which describe in detail the challenges that my father had, but also what he did represented in great part what all ethnics were experiencing, confronting during the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in Maine. There, that's my executive summary.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Lee Softly. Lee is the Dean of the University of Maine School of Law and former Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Judicial Court. When she was appointed Chief Justice in 2001, she was both Maine's first woman and the youngest person ever to serve in that position. Softly grew up in South Portland, Maine, and attended the University of Maine and the University of Maine School of Law. She was first appointed to the Maine District Court in 1990, to the Supreme Judicial Court in 1997, and sworn in as Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court on December 6, 2001. She served as Chief Justice until 2020, when she was hired as the 8th Dean of the University of Maine School of Law. You're muted. You're muted.
There we go. Thank you, Susan. You know, after a year of this, you would think we would get this mute button right. I'm going to get a t-shirt. So I just want to say, Susan, how much I appreciate you mentioning that I was the youngest appointed to be Chief Justice. It's a lovely thing to look back on and remember being young. But I want to begin this evening by expressing my gratitude to Severn and Darby Beliveau for allowing me to be part of this discussion, and particularly to Doug Rooks for the way he brought to life both an extraordinary man and the world that Albert Beliveau inhabited. So I'm going to begin by reading to you the eloquent words of former Chief Justice Dan Wathen. He says, from a veritable treasure trove of letters, documents, court records, family history, and new reports, Douglas Rooks has crafted a detailed account of Maine's first Franco-American justice. Contemporary readers will be struck by the civility, courtesy, and collegiality of Justice Beliveau and his peers. Overcoming racial and religious prejudice, his career was a triumph of the human spirit. I couldn't say it any better. This book has so much history and so many wonderful and colorful characters, it's hard to know where to start. However, true to form, Severn has told me where I am to start. And in just a moment, I will get to Albert Beliveau, the lawyer and jurist. But before I get there, I want to talk about another theme that resonated with me in Doug's writings. Albert Beliveau apparently took an early vow never to marry. He did eventually marry when he was 49, but before that, he had many women friends before he married his eventual long-term bride. And through his correspondence with many of those friends, a reader can see starkly the limitation on women's lives in the early 1900s. When Albert Beliveau graduated from law school in 1911, there were no women at that law school. Indeed, and this still makes me mad, in 1911, women had not yet even received the right to vote. It would be 9 more years before the Constitution would be amended to provide voting equality to women. And yet the women with whom Albert associated and corresponded were obviously bright, well-written women, and they were obviously drawn to his intellect and his engagement in the world. It's clear, however, that their own options were limited. Marriage or work that was generally secretarial in nature awaited many women of that time. Doug's personal stories and inclusion of the correspondence and circumstances of Albert's travel, friendship, and conviviality illuminate that reality in a very human way. When attorney Albert Beliveau became Superior Court Justice Beliveau in 1935, women had not yet come into the legal profession. Although Clara Hapgood Nash, possibly only the 5th lawyer licensed in the country, was practicing in Maine in 1872, although practice is an interesting word for what she was allowed to do. And Gail Laughlin, who held a law degree, served in the Maine legislature in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s. They were the exception to a single gender profession. Indeed, when Justice Beliveau began his work on the Superior Court, there were no women attorneys in the courtroom, no women on the bench, and a careful read of the book's description of Albert's work as a lawyer and a judge reveals no women in professional positions, such as investigators, law enforcement, or even medical experts. It was clearly and thankfully a very different time. But it's important to note that strong women in Albert's life really made a difference for him. When he finally married, he chose a woman who had attended Boston College, had a teaching certificate, and who was identified as having an independent streak. And his wife later attributed Albert's successful path in life to his mother, who Margaret described as a wonderful woman, very well educated, and she saved him from working in the mill. Which leads us now, Severn, I promised I would get there, to Albert's legal career, where there were many firsts. He did complete law school in 2 years rather than the 3 that students traditionally spent studying the law. When he took the bar exam, he received the highest score ever recorded at that time, including 100s on property and contracts. I think that's unheard of now. When he became the Oxford County Attorney in 1914, at the tender age of 27, he was officially the youngest person elected to that role. Of note was the civility of that election process. His predecessor, Frederick Dyer, wrote this to him, and I'm quoting, of course, from the book. Please accept my congratulations on your election. The campaign, as far as you and I were concerned, was entirely devoid of anything unpleasant and was conducted upon the most liberal of lines. I appreciate it. I sincerely hope your administration will be highly successful and enjoyable. And if there's anything I can do to contribute to that end, you may call upon me with assurance. Would that we could say those things about political campaigns today. So I'm going to fast forward to 1935, when Attorney Beliveau became Justice Beliveau of the Superior Court. Again, he was a first in so many categories. As Doug writes, Beliveau had achieved more firsts. The first attorney from Rumford to receive a state court appointment, and his supporters emphasized, the first of French-Canadian ancestry. Still relatively young for a judge, he was now 48, and unusually, he was still a bachelor, but that was soon to change. And regarding my earlier reference to the missing women in the legal profession, Doug quotes the collegial and humble newly appointed justice as saying this: "The only hope I have is that I will merit the confidence of the attorneys who have occasion to work before me. I realize it's going to be very difficult until I get my feet placed, but if the boys will be a little patient, I think in time everything will work out all right." The book contains some very interesting recitations of the trials and judicial work of Superior Court Justice Beliveau, and I commend it to you. These were the days when justices commented on the evidence to the jury, a fascinating time in jurisprudence. Among the descriptions of his decisions is an occasion when Justice Beliveau presided over the trial of a 13-year-old boy who was convicted of killing his father. Doug reports this: told by hospital staff that Collins could likely kill again, Beliveau sentenced him to 5 to 10 years at the state prison rather than the state school for boys. Again, it was a first. That boy was one of the youngest inmates ever sent to state prison in Thomaston. And this is what Justice Beliveau said: "I dislike to do this, but I see no other course for me to pursue. Although today's judges have more options, judges still struggle to this very day with sentencing options to children in this age group." And hearing his words then were fairly prophetic. Justice Belivau's years on the Superior Court occurred at a time when the bar didn't do formal evaluations of judicial work, but it was widely understood that the justice was hardworking, fair, civil, and very well respected. Indeed, it was hard for many to understand why it took 19 years of that excellent work before he received a nomination to the law court. The stories of some of the justices' biggest cases are fascinating, and again, I commend them to you. After 19 years on the Superior Court, he was finally nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Judicial Court. There's no doubt that his many years on the Superior Court prepared him well for the law court, where, as we all know, he was once again a first, the first Franco-American to serve on Maine's highest court. He served from 1954 to 58, and he wrote 36 well-reasoned opinions. Although he was not accorded the hoped-for role of Chief Justice, he lived long enough to encourage Armand Dufresne to accept the role of the first Franco-American, CJ. As the first Franco-American to serve on the law court, Albert Beliveau's intellect, civility, and humanity served all of us well. So I will end where I began with a quote from the former Chief Justice in the book. This is Dan Wathen again. What impressed Dan most about Albert Beliveau was how he converted his separateness into a source of strength rather than a source of weakness. Thank you, Doug, Severn, and Darby, for making sure we all know the history of Justice Albert Beliveau.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to introduce the author. Doug Rooks is the author of 2 previous books, Statesman, George Mitchell and the Art of the Possible, and Rise, Decline, and Renewal, the Democratic Party in Maine. He has served as editorial page editor for the Kennebec Journal in Augusta, editor and publisher of Maine Times, and has covered state government and politics for 36 years, currently as State House correspondent for the Portland Phoenix. His political columns appear in 4 daily newspapers, including the Times Record and Portsmouth Herald, and he is the recipient of numerous national and regional awards. Doug?
Thank you so much. I found, I'm sorry, I keep calling her Justice softly. It's an old habit, but I found that very moving because you really hit, like, to me, all my favorite parts of the book about the law. Including Dan Wathen's wonderful comments. I'm going to read 2 short excerpts from chapter 1, which work very well in this context. And I have to say that when I started doing the research, when I saw the first documents about the law school, I said, really? It's in Bangor. I really had no idea that there had been a law school in Bangor years ago. It started in 1897, unfortunately expired in 1919. And that's the section of the book that I'm going to read, because I think it may be news to some University of Maine alumni as well, that this was an important educational institution, which, alas, didn't make the grade long term. But it was very important in the lives of Albert and many of the lawyers of Maine at the time. And I think I noticed, even though these are relatively short passages, we hit all of the points of the subtitle. We hear about law, politics, and love. So here we go. This part is called Top of the Class. His experience and performance in law school were the making of Albert Beliveau as a professional, a breadwinner of considerable ability, and as an aspiring representative of the French-Canadian immigrants to Maine. He was always conscious of his heritage, however much he disliked being pigeonholed and discriminated against. The first University of Maine Law School was a small institution, even by turn-of-the-century standards, reflecting Maine's lack of a professional class beyond a few large cities and towns. Though Beliveau attended at the peak of the school's history, which lasted for just over 2 decades, he was among just 101 students. Among the few recorded facts of his time there was that he was a member of the Phi Delta Phi fraternity. Records of the Bangor Law School are scanty indeed. After the school abruptly shut down in 1919, they were apparently scattered. The University of Maine Alumni Association maintained some contact through its anniversary events, though even there the evidence is best described as sketchy. It is likely, however, that Beliveau made rooming arrangements similar to those of his friend and legal mentor, Judge Matthew McCarthy, since there was still no on-campus housing. Unlike McCarthy, he did not meet a future wife there, but from the early days, there are suggestions that Albert made many friends. From recollections of others recorded much later, it's also clear Albert was a brilliant student. The law course offered a 3-year course of study, and he finished in 2 years, a rare feat given the extensive study and writing required. In what might have been a forecast of his later career, one of his instructors credited him with an ability to apply common sense to legal principles. When it came time for the state bar exam, he achieved the highest score attained up to that time, 93 1/3, equaled by a classmate from Bangor, Charles Hosmer. Beliveau achieved his stellar results on the bar exam even before finishing law school. From some correspondence with the dean of the law school, William E. Waltz, which does survive, it's evident that his early graduation resulted in some administrative difficulties that spring. Waltz was trying to guide Beliveau through final exams, and on February 28th suggested that if Albert didn't plan to be in Bangor on examination day, he might be able to have Matthew McCarthy administer the exams or another man in good standing in place of him. A month later, he advised Beliveau he'd have to register for the spring term, pay tuition of $23.34, and a graduation fee of $10 to receive his diploma with the senior class. Waltz added, "In order to get your degree, you will have to be personally present at Orono on commencement day. The trustees would never excuse a man from attendance on that occasion if he lived in Maine." It was in Bangor that Albert began the first of his many close acquaintances with women he met at various points in his life. His correspondence with men is mostly businesslike or lightly jesting, but his letters to and from women have a more intimate quality. His own letters are scattered, but from those of his female correspondents that he preserved, there are clear inferences that his friendship ran the full range of emotion, from companionship and mild flirtation to passionate attachments, allowing for the greater reticence characteristic of early 20th century culture and expression. By chance, there is a detailed recollection by one of his first loves, contained in a letter written later in the 1920s, after a visit to the home and its formal gardens that Beliveau had built in Rumford for his mother and the rest of his family. Margaret McManus, who grew up in the Bangor area and later married a local man, Frank Carroll, was a year younger than Albert and seems to have been familiar with his family, probably through Matthew McCarthy. She was highly educated for her time and taught school for many years, even though she also raised two daughters and a son. She was the first of several women named Margaret to play an important role in his life. In an undated letter, Margaret began, "I must congratulate you upon your beautiful home. I never saw anything half so beautiful in all my life before. It is an artistic gem from beginning to end, and I suppose you love every line and curve of it. The appointments and furnishings are perfect." She was concerned about his commitment to support so many family members, however, and added, "Albert, I am afraid of all that responsibility that you are carrying. Don't be angry with me if I speak too freely, but see all of those people who are dependent upon you for occupations, which means their livelihoods. I do think you are wonderful. I never saw anyone so good to his folks in all my experience, and I honestly would hate anything that would hurt your magnificent courage." Albert never said so in a surviving letter, yet it's clear that it was about this time he took a vow, not necessarily of celibacy, but never to marry, a vow he kept for 25 years, long after most of his contemporaries were raising families. His commitment to his family remained absolute, and his relations with several women have the appearance of fleeting affairs. He never promised marriage to any woman until much later. Margaret McManus was one of several women who married another after Albert told her of his vow. Her reference to being much married referred only to the unhappiness of her marriage. She never divorced. Yet the letters he kept, well over 100, from women who wrote to him, suggest that whatever his actions, they still had a place in his heart. The second passage is kind of self-explanatory, but it deals with what happened at the end of the law school. And it's called The German Scare. There was a melancholy postscript to Belliveau's time in law school that must have haunted him long afterward. The law school, like all institutions of higher education, had been depopulated by the volunteering and subsequent draft of young men for the American Expeditionary Force, rapidly deployed in France starting in 1917. Albert joined the troops there in 1918 after training at Plattsburgh, New York, the previous fall. Commissioned as a second lieutenant, he served on the judge advocate staff and remained in Paris long enough to celebrate the Allied victory. The Bangor Law School was less fortunate. It did not long survive the war and shut down in 1919, even as most of the soldiers were returning home. The primary reason was the dismissal of the dean who had led the school through almost its entire existence. Beliveau may have heard the news first from Margaret McManus. In a letter she wrote, "Did you know that Dean Waltz has been removed from his position? Law school is now in Orono with President Alley as dean. A lot of the boys felt very badly about his removal. Too bad he should be found wanting. He is still around. He has a brother on the Harvard faculty, and they spent the summer near Southwest Harbor, where I am told that their every move was watched. I guess they were found to be quite harmless, though. Though clearly not a German spy or agent, Waltz was nonetheless judged to be an unsuitable influence on law students. He came under suspicion even before the US declaration of war in April 1917 and lost his position that fall. Maine newspapers were reticent about the reasons. A more candid description appeared much later in the Journal of Education, a national publication, in its March 15, 1918 issue. University of Maine President Robert J. Alley, who oversaw the law school, convened a 3-member panel to review the charges and then take whatever action it decided on. Alley chose former Congressman Frank Guernsey of Dover, later Dover-Foxcroft, Frederick Strickland of Bangor, and William H. Looney of Portland, to whom was referred the responsible and delicate duty of passing upon the case. Guernsey, a Republican, had served in Congress from 1918 to 17, representing the 4th District. He had lost a U.S. Senate primary in 1916. While not formally the chair of the panel, he was its most influential member. William Waltz had been hired as a professor of German on the Orono campus and appointed the law school's dean in 1902. The Journal of Education reported, alleged pro-German utterances was the cause assigned. Students at the school have stood by Dean Waltz to the end, maintaining that while his sympathies were clearly with Germany before the war, he has made no pro-German utterances for the last year. Waltz was not the only academic dismissed from his post during the war. 3 professors at the University of Michigan also lost their jobs. Some universities, however, rejected such charges, citing academic freedom. In Maine, the panel, having considered, after careful and conscientious study of the reasons urged against his retention as Dean of the College of Law, that the highest interest of the state of Maine and the university demand his removal. Upon his refusal to resign, the committee summarily removed him and informed him he would not be reelected. It could hardly have been of solace to Waltz or Beliveau that the report concluded, this painful duty was exercised by the members of the committee solely in the interests of the university. The relations of the committee with Dean Waltz have always been of the most kindly character and marked by the kindest feelings. Hence, the action was dictated by public and not private reasons. The panel justified its decision with high rhetoric. In the crisis of our nation's history, when the very soul and manhood of our country are making untold sacrifices to uphold the honor and glory of our flag, the committee felt they would be recreant in their duty if they permitted Professor Waltz to longer occupy the position as Dean of the College of Law. It found that Waltz's sympathies, as well as his convictions, are with Germany and against the United States and her allies. Academic freedom went unmentioned. Ironically, Waltz seems to have been more capable than his more highly credentialed predecessor, George Gardner, who served only 3 years before departing, it was said, to accept a more attractive and lucrative position at Boston University. In just his first 2 years, Waltz had increased enrollment from 47 to 71. After his departure, the law school graduated just 1 more class. In 1919, a new dean was appointed. One of Belliveau's future Democratic Party associates and rivals, Frederick Harold Dubord of Waterville, had enrolled for the school's final year, but had to finish his law degree at Boston University. There were several reasons for the demise of Maine's first law school, including the shortage of students in wartime and the failure to recruit a new dean. Another factor was a new requirement that would have disqualified Beliveau from entry. 2 years of college attendance was now mandatory. The attempt to raise standards at the same time the school's leader was removed proved fatal, and Beliveau, Matthew McCarthy, and hundreds of other Maine's lawyers no longer had a functioning alma mater. Beliveau never paid a price commensurate with that exacted from Dean Waltz in any of his dealings with the majority culture, language, or religion, and his own wartime service was to yield significant advantages for his later career. The law school's end, however, was a stark reminder that he was also seen differently from other lawyers, judges, businessmen, or politicians, something he always bore in mind as he continued to build his legal career back home in Rumford.
Well done.
Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you all. We're at a point now where we can entertain questions and solicit answers. If you didn't notice, just use the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question there, and we'll get to as many as we can. We do have some that have come in. One from our former Attorney General, Jim Tierney, asked, what kind of practice did the judge have before he went on the court? Was it just in Oxford County? Was he a trial lawyer? Did he do criminal defense? And there's a follow-up question Jim will ask, but I'll let you get to that, and then we'll go to that follow-up one because it's a relevant one.
I can respond to that, John, if you'd like. Back in those days, as you know, lawyers had a general practice. They did everything. They did divorce work, which was not my father's favorite because he had strong feelings about divorce, but he had to do that. Did a lot of real estate work, but litigation and trial work was his forte. He developed a very strong reputation of being a very effective advocate, and his practice really was in Androscoggin County, in Auburn, the courthouse in Auburn, South Paris for Oxford County, Farmington, and Augusta. So it was really Western Maine. But he had developed a strong reputation, so much so that he became a very successful lawyer during that time frame between his tenure in the military and his appointment in 1935.
I was going to mention, adding to what Severn said, that I think one of his advantages was that he did play many different roles. In fact, really one of the most colorful parts of the book was, it was really only 2 years he was Oxford County Attorney. He was defeated for re-election when he ran again. But during those 2 years, he presided over 2 rather spectacular murder trials, one of which involved him and a Pinkerton detective heading off in the woods above Coccajo. And you can imagine what that was like in those days, 10 miles through the rain to a logging camp to arrest the suspect. I mean, you really can't make this stuff up. And I only regret that there were no illustrations of that wonderful moment around the campfire when they arrested this guy who obviously had no idea somebody was coming to the logging camp. And he really had a very varied career. And I think that's one of the reasons he was so successful as a judge. He really was able to see the law from all sides. And his political experience, I think, probably also toughened him a little bit against the adversity that he did face. But, just thinking about the several years that I spent on the book, it's hard to just pick out a few highlights. You can open the book almost anywhere and find a good story or an illustration of some unusual quality that he had as a lawyer.
Well, I suspect that one of those stories dealt with an attempted bribe.
Yes.
I don't know if Doug and Severn, if you can, one or both of you could address that.
Severn should definitely do that one because he was in the house at the time.
I was there. This happened.
He was there.
In the 50s. I was in the garden with my father. As you know, he had developed this wonderful garden, and it was his pride and joy. It was a vegetable and flower garden. And this Cadillac pulled up in front of our home in Hancock Street in Rumford, and this fellow by the name of Napoli, I think was his name, came out, and my father knew him. They chatted for a few minutes, and my father said to me, "Severn, you better go to the house now." So I went to the house, and he came in about 10 minutes later, really upset. Got on the phone, called the chief of the state police, and it turned out that this fellow had offered my father $25,000 and that new Cadillac if he would treat these 2 or 3 men who had been convicted in Cumberland County Superior Court the previous week on a number of gambling and illegal alcohol sales. I forgot what it was, but these were Italians from the North End. And so this fellow had met my father socially a couple of occasions. In any event, they arrested the fellow as he was leaving Maine and caught him in Kittery. He was ultimately convicted. In the meantime, there was a lot of drama in Rumford at the time because of who this person was and who they thought he represented. So I recall that my brother, my sister, and I were on the second floor, and in the evening around 8 o'clock at night, 2 state troopers would arrive at our home and lived with us for about a week and 10 days until things settled down. It was really kind of a highlight because I recognized what was happening, and I immediately resorted to my BB gun. I was prepared to defend the family if necessary. Yeah.
Doug, anything to add to that?
I don't think I can add much to that story, but yes, the details are wonderful. And just, you can imagine, I mean, the judge was very informal. He was often seen walking downtown to his law office in his old clothes. He would just actually, he'd put on a robe over his gardening equipment. It was quite amazing that way. And I can depict this scene though, where this guy who he knows drives up to the street, stops to talk, and suddenly it's like, you mean what? Yes, it must have been quite a moment for Albert to imagine that one of his neighbors or former neighbors would do this. But anyway, but it did happen. We have it well documented.
That's great. Well, thank you. Another question, can you give us a sense of the degree to which the Supreme Court, when Justice Beliveau was Justice Beliveau, dealt with cases involving discrimination against Franco-Americans and other ethnic minorities in Maine?
I quickly respond. I read all my father's opinions, and none of those touch upon that issue. And I don't believe during that time frame, in up through the 50s when he was there, that there was any, because we didn't have the laws back in those days that we have today. That was the big issue. We've enacted a number of statutes since then that protect and prevent this type of behavior. So to answer your question, no, I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, there really was no recourse for a lot of these. I mean, we tend to live in the modern world, but really until the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights, which, as we all know, ended up not applying just to racial discrimination, but also to discrimination against women and religious discrimination and a lot of other things. So we live in a different time. Back then, the only check on bigotry really was the community, and sometimes the community rallied around, and sometimes they did not.
The only other point I'd make was that I think one of the highlights of my father's career was when he was appointed by President Eisenhower to serve on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and he was the representative from Maine. And I think that in part reflected his interest in ethics and his role in the Franco community and generally supporting minorities. And I think that that appointment, I said, served that purpose.
Thank you. Severn, what, if anything, did you learn from Doug's research about your father or your family that you didn't already know?
Well, in a very general way, that there was no obstacle. I mean, he had, I wasn't aware of, for instance, that we knew he ran for Congress in 1928 and 1930, but we didn't have the details of the campaign. And Doug, through his research and others, described in great detail what the campaigning was like back in those days. It was far more informal than what we see today. The other part of it I learned was that he had varied interests in addition to totally committed to his family. I mean, he built that lovely home that we were raised in Rumford for his mother, and his sisters and others lived there for a period of time. And he was very close to them, very supportive of them. But also, I think he recognized the plight of ethnics. Back in those days, there was a lot of anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, and so forth. And so he quickly, and also was very proud of his culture and his heritage and his language. And he was quick to criticize fellow Francos who either anglicized their names or refused to speak French and things of that nature. So I think he impressed upon my brother, my sister, and I the importance of our heritage, our culture, and that's one of the reasons I think that motivated us to support the writing of this book.
In Western Maine and in Oxford County in particular, obviously another prominent family besides, or individual besides the Belliveaus were the Muskies, Ed Muskie. Can you talk about the relationship between your two families?
Yes, I can. My father was very close with Ed Muskie's father. Ed Muskie's father was a tailor in Rumford. Matter of fact, he helped. I think he may have assisted in and making my father's first row. They were fairly close, and Mr. Muskie Sr. was active in the Democratic Party in Maine and in Rumford at the time. And so that when Muskie was elected in 1954, my father had been on the bench just a few years at that time. They were friendly. I mean, at that point, Muskie had left Rumford. He established his law office in Waterville, so he had separated himself from the town. Had been away for 15 years or so after World War II. So they weren't particularly close. They knew each other. They knew the families knew one another. So that was obviously a source of some disappointment on my father's part when he was denied the appointment by a person from his native hometown. So, yeah, and we know the family very well. We know all of Muskie's sisters lived in Rumford, married local people, and but Muskie left. When he left Rumford completely. He never returned. He lived in Waterville in that area, then obviously Beliveau and ultimately Washington, D.C.
I would add to that that's really one of the high points of the book was the decision by then Governor Muskie, who had just been reelected with a big majority in 1956. Right after the election, he appointed a whole slate of judges, but not Albert. He appointed a very distinguished judge named Robert Williamson, who was very, very Anglo, very Protestant, very distinguished, Harvard Law, all that, but was a Republican. And Muskie, of course, was a Democrat. And there had been a certain expectation he would pick Albert, recognizing his seniority on the bench, even though he'd only been on the high court for 4 years. And I have to say that is a bit of a mystery because, as I point out in the book, he could have actually appointed Albert, who was due to retire in about 18 months, and then he could have appointed Williamson as well, which several other judges or governors, including Burton Cross, had already done this. They'd appoint somebody near retirement, they would retire, and then they'd get their long-term choice. And Muskie could have done that, but he did not. And unfortunately, I really couldn't find any documentation for why the decision was made. There probably isn't any, because these are very closely held secrets by governors. But it was definitely a big moment in Albert's life, and he didn't mince any words. I mean, he apparently really he rarely swore, but whenever Ed Muskie's name came up after that, he did. And Muskie himself, I think, recognized this. He was very friendly and attentive to both Severn and Darby, Albert Jr., at conventions and things like that. And he did post a very nice tribute to Albert on the occasion of his 80th birthday in the Congressional Record. So I think he tried to make amends, but of course, those are the decisions that you have to live with.
That's great. You mentioned Darby, Albert Beliveau Jr., who is Severn's brother. Doug and Severn and Darby, if you'd like to weigh in, what was the influence? Can you explain the influence of Justice Beliveau on your own pursuit of a legal career in politics?
Darby, you want to answer that? Yeah. If not, well, our daily lives were consumed by law and politics. I mean, that was a topic of discussion at home constantly. So we were exposed to my grandfather McCarthy, graduated from the University of Maine Law School, first graduating class in 1900. My uncle William McCarthy was a lawyer, practiced with us, became a Superior Court judge. So we were exposed to the law and politics from a very early age. My father never encouraged us to pursue this career, never discouraged us, but it was kind of a natural process for us after college to go to law school because that's all we knew at the time. And back in the 60s, and when we all graduated, you didn't have the options you have today. I mean, you either went to law school or dental school, and at the time it was a very, very easy way. At least it was for me and for Darby. We both went to Georgetown, and then I came back here, became county attorney, and Darby worked with the Department of Justice for several years before he returned to Rumford. So it's kind of evolved because that's what we were exposed to. We knew no other career, no other profession.
Doug, how much do you get into Justice Beliveau, the father, and his role over and relationship with the family?
Well, that was a dilemma because, of course, most of the documents relate to his official duties, professional responsibilities, his duties as state commander of the American Legion, all that. But there was quite a lot of material, kind of a stray, books he would order, wines he would get, cigars that he would. And I actually ended up putting a whole chapter together called Private Life. And I think that deals with the family issues the most. And there's a little bit at the end about his remarkable widow, Severn's father, Margaret McCarthy, who had a quite distinguished late career herself as an advocate for what we then called handicapped children. And she really put together some of the very first special education classes anywhere in Maine. This was before the federal law or any of the major efforts to do that and standardize it. So, we had, it was very interesting just to follow the family through. Darby had a big role, for instance, when they decided to merge the Catholic churches that had been primarily the Franco-American church with the Irish church, and that was quite a feat. And Darby pulled it off. So, the following the family tapestry. The book is about Albert, but I couldn't really ignore the remarkable progeny that he produced, and it made for a kind of a nice rounding out of the personal life.
An important theme, I suspect, in the book, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but is the Justice Beliveau and the Democratic Party and the role that he and his family have played in the Democratic Party in Maine and beyond after that. Somebody asked the question, Severn, why did he become a Democrat?
Well, I think the short answer is, why did he and other Francos? Because all the mill owners were Republicans. Simple as that. I mean, the hierarchy, the business community, those who made the decisions were all Republicans. And they, at the time, the ethnics, the newly arrivals from into Maine were subject to very harsh living conditions, very difficult lives. And so the Democratic Party provided them with an alternative. And the Democratic Party, its constitution or platform was far more progressive, far more inclusive. As a matter of fact, one of the stories that somehow we've neglected to include in the book was back in the late 20s, early 30s. My father was assisting in organizing the workers at the mill in Rumford, the Oxford Paper Company, and the owner of the mill, the Chisholm family from Connecticut, the old Hugh Chisholm, called my father and he said, Albert, if you continue to pursue this, he said, we may have to ask you to leave town. How's that? So if there's any doubt at that point as to what he was doing, believe me, that confirmed it. And he was a strong advocate. I mean, even after when he retired from the law court, he used to come to the Democrat conventions with me. He's in the 70s and early 80s, just to hang around. Yeah, so he had that virus that we all had, that political virus.
Yeah, I never got the sense that the Republican Party had the slightest attraction for him. It was everything, establishment that he really had to contend against in terms of his own advancement. And frankly, the Francos really were and the Irish and a few other mostly Catholic ethnic groups were the mainstays of the Democratic Party. They could never achieve a majority statewide. Muskie was the first one to do that in 1954. But they did, they were able to win legislative seats. They obviously dominated Lewiston politics and to some degree still do. So I just think there was no real choice there. It was just, you're a Democrat, but he was a very passionate Democrat. For instance, Democrats in Maine were rather conservative, and some of them recoiled were at Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. But Albert supported Roosevelt down the line. He even supported the court backing plan, which was quite interesting because he was asked by several friends not to, but he said, no, the president proposed it, I'm for it. So there you go.
Well, we've come to the end of the hour and it's unfortunate. I think on behalf, I don't know, Susan, if there's any final words you want to share, or Doug or Severn?
I would just say thank you. This has been a wonderful hour to experience and listen to Justice Softly and Severn as I've had many times, but he always says something interesting and new. And thank you to the University of Maine Alumni Association. You've been great hosts.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just enjoyed Doug and just underscoring what he's saying. This has been a great experience for us, and I'm very pleased with the support we've received from the university on this undertaking. I think it's added a whole new dimension, I think, to the university and to the whole Franco community in Maine. So thanks to everyone who was involved in this.
Well, thank you all. And as I
Good
mentioned,
show, Severn.
as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, we will be sending everybody who registered for this webinar a link to the recording and also a link to how you can purchase the book through University of Maine Press. We'll also provide links to the Franco-American Center and other resources that might be of interest to you given the topic tonight. So on behalf of all of our speakers and presenters, thank you all for watching us, and take care and be well.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Yep. Bye-bye.